Hello, and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne. We all know that life is hard, right? It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it can be wonderful all at the same time. My hope is that we can take a deep dive into self-development topics and explore life's lessons through book clubs, conversations, and interviews. And together, we can uncover the lessons that others have already learned to help us navigate this crazy, wonderful ride called life. Hello and welcome to Message in the Middle with Marianne, and today with my guest, Carolyn Birrell. Carolyn retired young and relocated after a successful career working for the American Cancer Society and later as a real estate agent. Soon after her move, she was faced with the realization that her mother had dementia and could no longer live by herself. Based on her mom's declining condition, Carolyn relocated her mother to be close to her and spent the next 8 years caring for her aging mom while learning all things dementia. Carolyn, thank you so much for joining me here today and agreeing to talk to me and sharing your story. I think this topic of dementia and aging parents is something many people in our age range are going to start to have to deal with or already are dealing with and often feel ill-equipped to deal with. So I think your story is really important. Can you share with me a little bit about how you came to know that your mom was failing and sort of how that started to play out for you?
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here, Marianne. Thank you for having me on your show. I think with my mother, it came in very slowly. Like I described it in the book as like waves on a beach, like a little something on one day, and then it would recede, and I would think, no, that was just me being a little bit too judgmental. And she repeated herself, 5 times in the last conversation we had, but maybe that's just old age and quirkiness. So I went on, I have to say, for years like that with my mom, because she talked a good game. We had our wake up morning calls almost every day. Her time was 10 a.m. She'd come in from her walk, look at the clock and see that it was 7 a.m. my time. And I'd sit on the couch and have coffee with her pretty much every morning. And we'd talk about her walk and her neighbors and the cat she had recently adopted and, the plate of lasagna she made for her neighbor who was single again. And it always seemed just fine, like, kind of a perfect picture. And I was always relieved that my mother was happy and okay. I was 3,000 miles away from her. I lived in Idaho and she lived in North Georgia. So I think a lot of that came from just wanting it to be okay and brushing off the little things I noticed and didn't really want to take a look at because everything else pretty much seemed okay until I got a very early wake up call. It was like 5 a.m. from her local sheriff one morning. And he called me to complain that my mother had been seen driving on the wrong side of the road and cutting people off. And he wanted me to talk to her.
Wow.
As I was trying to wake myself up and, settle all this in my head, I thought, how in the world am I going to talk to my mother and tell her that, the sheriff just called and told on her, basically, in her small town, and that her neighbors were watching her, obviously. And I just knew that wasn't going to go over well. So I kind of brushed that off, told him I would take care of it. And of course, I didn't, because I knew exactly how that call was going to go. Then about a month or two later, I got a different phone call from the Department of Health and Family Services. My mother had fallen and been taken to the hospital, and her blood pressure medication, her diabetes medication was all off. And when they got her stabilized and able to leave the hospital, she had nobody to call. She didn't remember any names, any friends, any family. So they assigned her a caseworker, and the caseworker took her home and found my number on her refrigerator and called me to report the condition my mother's house was in. Now, I had been going to my mother's house annual trips. I would fly out there once a year and talk to her on the morning phone calls. And although her housekeeping skills seemed to be slipping and the place was definitely not the way I would like to see it, she was insistent that everything was fine and don't touch her things and don't tell her what to do, and she's a grown woman and I don't need to clean her kitchen. So I kind of also ignored those things until the woman from Health and Family Services told me that it was a literal pigsty and that my mother was punching holes in the bottom of a chicken soup can to drink, and that she was walking around with the lights off. And if I didn't do something about it, the state was going to step in.
Wow. Wow. So, do you think looking back, when you talk about sort of ignoring some of those signs, do you think that you feel that you were ignoring them now just because it's retrospect and you know everything? Or do you really feel like they were there and you were missing them? I mean, you know what I mean? Were they subtle enough that you were really able to miss them? Or do you think you were trying to ignore them, like you just didn't want to deal with it? And listen, any question I ask is no judgment intended. Obviously, we're trying to educate people and also let them know they're not alone, right? Because there's probably other people going through this.
Absolutely. And that was the whole reason I wrote the book, because I did make so many mistakes all the way through her stages. You know, there are 7 stages to Alzheimer's, and I was with her through all of them and learning as I went and making all the same mistakes that now when I talk to somebody who's read my book and said, "Oh, I did that too. I was a horrible person and I couldn't live with myself." And then I realized other people did the same thing. You know, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to correct her. I didn't know I was supposed to try to see it through her eyes and agree with her and distract her. You know, all of the things. I'll say to your question that Alzheimer's and all dementias, they don't just present themselves like, bam, your loved one has Alzheimer's. They come in so slowly and subtly that it starts with something as simple as maybe forgetting an appointment, missing a birthday, being, late for something they were always there for, missing church on Sunday morning because they didn't realize it was Sunday. Well, they write that up to, oh, I didn't look at my calendar. Oh, I'm so busy, I forgot our lunch date. Oh, I'm just scattered, smothered, and covered today. I couldn't, I forgot to call you back. And those are the ways that, we all do that, don't we? I walk into the
Yeah.
kitchen with my reading glasses on my head, looking for my reading glasses.
Yeah.
So it's so hard for the average person to differentiate between a real problem and just everyday life, especially when the person exhibiting those symptoms is telling you that there's no problem. So now you're in this position of saying, I think there's a problem, but how do I insert myself into this person's life and take away their individuality, their independence? My mother was driving on the wrong side of the road. How in the world was I going to take her car keys from her when I lived 3,000 miles away and she was insisting to me that the sheriff was lying?
Yeah.
So that's the problem, I think, so much with dementia, that it's sneaky and it comes in so slowly, insidiously, that the average person and the average person isn't trained. None of us have experience with dementia until we have experience with dementia.
Right. Unfortunately, right. Do you think, looking back, do you think she knew? Or do you think that she just, like you said, we all do some of these things. Do you think she was just chalking it up to, well, I am getting a little older, so of course I'm going to forget some things here and there, and then didn't realize when it got to the extreme?
I think there are different kinds of people. And I've now talked to enough of them that I would say plenty of them have loved ones who say, I think something's wrong with me. I think I'm forgetting things. I feel like something's not right. And they say it out loud and they go to the doctor and they get tested. Then there are the other people who don't say it out loud, which my mother would have been that person. And they become paranoid immediately because something's not right. But instead of saying something's not right with me, they project outward and they insist that somebody broke in last night and moved all her magazines around. That was early on when she was convinced of that. Or somebody hit my car and dented the bumper, but it wasn't me, because she didn't remember doing it and she was sure that it happened to her. So I think again, people are different and they approach things differently, and not all of them recognize it, or they adjust for it. and account for it differently and insist it's something else that's going on.
So, talk to us a little bit about what that was like for you and how that played out so you get the call, you start putting the pieces together after the caseworker tells you what's going on there, you realize this is something and it's more drastic, and then make the decision that in of itself is kind of huge that you're going to relocate her to be near you because, gosh, that's a lot of responsibility. And I imagine came with mixed emotions. How did that play out? So what did that look like? Did she want to come to live with you? Was she happy about it? Was she resistant? What did that look like?
Yeah. With my mom, none of these things were a straight line. Everything was a series of loop-de-loops. I'd been talking to my mother for years. I had lived in North Idaho for 6 years before I was able to move her out there. And I moved her out there by tricking her. She had every reason not to come to Idaho, not to leave her house, not to leave her friends, not to leave her church and her garden, even her cat. She had reasons why she couldn't move to be closer to me. My sister and I talked on the phone after Mrs. Bream called me from the Department of Health and Family Services, and we actually came up with a plan for my brother to go live with my mother, and that fell apart. So this went on for months and months while we were trying to figure out a way to get her closer to me by having her agree, which she would not. So once again, with dementia, how do you insist that somebody sell their home and move and relocate them? The lucky thing for me in my situation was my mother was just far enough along that she was trickable. And we told her she was going to visit my sister in New York. And they drove north while I stayed behind, got her house ready to sell, cleaned the whole thing out, 20 years of accumulation and hoarding, and moved the U-Haul trailer from Georgia to Idaho, unpacked into another house that we were setting her up in with just her choice things that stayed. And then my sister flew her from New York to Idaho a week and a half later. All of this happened like in a whirlwind. And all of this happened while my mother was acting out. She escaped from my sister's apartment. She was picked up by the police in the grocery store parking lot, trying to get into cars. She got to Idaho and promptly, left the house every chance she could. I started getting phone calls and texts from people saying, "Hey, your mother's down on the South Hill. She's got 2 grocery bags in her hands. Do you want me to stop and pick her up?" Lucky for me, I lived in a small town, and that sort of thing happened on a daily basis. All hell broke loose about 6 months in when she started burning mail from her neighbors on her coffee table. And I couldn't have enough eyes on her. And that was when I moved her into her first assisted living home.
Wow. I want to touch on that move into the home, but I want to ask you first. So obviously there were a lot of trials and tribulations along the way once you made this decision and the discovery. How did you keep positive in that? And there's typically some lashing out. I'm guessing that you were the brunt of some things. And how do you sort of keep showing up, keep loving where you need to love and being present where you need to be present when you probably wanted to just curl up in the bed and make this all go away? I'm putting words in your mouth, but I'm guessing that is a true story.
There were so many mornings that I didn't want to go see her. And I got up and I went out of a sense of obligation and fear that I would open her front door and something would be wrong, that, she'd be dead on the living room floor because she had fallen, off the edge of the couch. I just never knew with her. There were dozens and dozens of these examples and things that my mother threw at me. I called them tennis balls whizzing at my head. She was like a tennis machine stuck on high, and those balls just kept coming. And I didn't know how to handle any of these things. And I started reading books and looking for them in the library and just not finding that book that connected with me about the little things. What do you do when your mother tells you she knows you're stealing her pension check from her? How do you answer that accusation? And what do you do when your mother's up on the highway, walking along the side of the highway with a gallon of milk in her hands, and you're trying to get her to turn around and come home because somebody called you and said, "Hey, your mom's up by the car wash." How do you get her to go home? These things happened on a daily basis for me. And I was drowning Literally, I was having crying jags in the post office. I would burst out in tears in the grocery store when somebody said, "Hey, how's your mom?" And I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know where to find help. And I slowly did here and there. But it was after many, many emails and back and forths with friends and writing things down on paper that I realized, oh my gosh, I have the pages of the book I needed to read. These are the examples that I was searching for. And now I've lived them. And I may have made a ton of mistakes, but I think people need to know that so that they can do it different, the next time. I'll tell you though, the sense of love that you asked me about, in the end, what I think I did the most was sense of responsibility, sense of obligation, and daughterly love that didn't always feel the good kind. I was the taskmaster. I was the one who made sure she got up in the morning and had breakfast and was safe at lunchtime and that we had dinner together. I was that person. And I was the one taking care of the bills and the medical appointments and the grocery shopping. But that also made me the jailer for her. In her eyes, I had taken away every sense of independence and choice. So she lashed out, and she lashed out at me while I was trying to keep her safe. She was so mad, so angry with me. And she told me how disappointed she was in me. And how could she have raised a daughter so controlling and mean and shifty? Because of course I was stealing from her. I had taken her car from her. All of the things that I would never wish on anyone, they're going to have to do. They're going to have to do.
It breaks my heart to hear you. I can imagine and I can sort of feel the pain, not a little bit, but probably the pain that you felt in there, and sort of the dichotomy of how much you loved her, but also how frustrated you were with her at the time. And I'm so sorry that you had to go through that, but also I'm so grateful that you're sharing your story, because I do know there are other people out there even in my own circle, that are suffering from the start of some of this, and hearing from somebody else and knowing somebody that's telling the story, the real story. So it's not all prettied up, and you can feel like, I'm not going crazy. Like, this is real. This is all these feelings, all these things, they're real. And I think you're validating that for people. So I'll just say thank you for anybody that hears that and reads your book. And I wanted to touch on that and why you felt like you wanted to take your journals with your most inner thoughts and share them with the world. And you touched on that. So you're trying to give a book, a sort of a guidebook out there to people that you didn't have.
Yeah.
What's been the response from people?
It's been a fantastic response. I just got an email 2 days ago from my website. Somebody, took it upon themselves to click the contact me button on my website and just say, I just want you to know I finished reading your book. And I just lost my mother recently. And I was so many things to her. I was her husband. I was her brother. I was her son. And she never knew. She never knew which one I was. And after so many interactions with her, I would go out to my car and I would simply cry. And it meant the world to me that I found out and realized that I was normal after reading your book. And I thought to myself, there it is. There's the reason, or at least one of them.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. And just to say it out loud, I was going to plug it, but you kind of rolled into the book. So it's Walking with Faye is the book's name. And we'll also put it in, all the show notes and whatnot, but definitely worth people checking out. I just want to make sure we say the name of it. So I want to touch on, so you said, you got to the point where basically she became too dangerous that you made the decision to put her into a facility. I feel like that's probably a really hard decision. And I can just imagine the thought process and sort of the tugging at your feelings around what the right thing to do there is. So was she at a point where she didn't know that she was going in a facility versus being in her own home or being near you guys? Like, how did that play out? Was she too far gone? I don't even know if that's the right thing to say, but
yeah, far enough along in the disease.
Yeah.
No, in fact, she was still in that half and half kind of stage, I would call it. Sometimes she was very lucid, but she was trickable. So one of the things that we all learn when we're dealing with a loved one with dementia is something called therapeutic fibbing. It's a real thing. And it's sort of like telling somebody what they want to hear so that they feel better about what's happening to them. So for my mom, I told her that her roof was leaking and we needed an entire new roof. So since the roof was going to come off the house, we needed to move her to a place where she could live and cook her dinners and sleep until the roof was repaired. That was how we got her to this assisted living place. Now, that got her there, but then she was mad again. And she couldn't remember why she was mad. She was just really, really mad. And I think I was one of the records, because normally they give you a 7-day cooling off period before they suggest you come back to see your loved one when you bring them to an assisted living, especially with dementia. And mine lasted for 3 sets of 7 days. My mother was just so mad, but she became quickly acclimated to the place. And I did have to move her a number of times until her final place. As the disease progressed, she needed more and more care, and she was harder and harder for them to handle in different places. Another thing that most people will experience with their loved one.
I actually love that point about the 7-day cool-off period. I've never heard that personally. I bet there's other people that haven't. And so again, to normalize it, right? You probably needed that too. A mental health break, right? Gosh, I can only imagine what you went through. So I want to touch on, so we talked about a lot of the more difficult times and some of the sort of chaos she put you through. But I also want to touch on a different side of that, because I think, again, to normalize the whole gamut of it, there were some pretty funny incidents that happened, or some pretty funny, looking back, funny, maybe not funny in in the moment. Can you share a few of those stories with us?
Yeah, and that's one of the things I talk to people now about too, is if you can find it within yourself to just take a second and laugh, find whatever that is humorous and laugh at it and try to laugh with them. Because after a while, I think we get so focused on our job. Our job at hand is to keep our loved ones safe. And after a while, they just aggravate the heck out of us, because they repeat themselves so many times, or they walk out that front door and take off on us, and we're looking for them so often, or they're saying that terrible thing to us over and over again, and we're just tired of hearing it. That's the danger that we fall in. But in between all that, there are some pretty funny things that go on. My mother one day found herself up in the cherry tree. She had been watching these cherries for weeks and eating green cherries. And I had up to here with trying to keep her from eating the green cherries. But then one day, miraculously, they were ripe. Well, she decided she needed to go up high, where the better cherries were. And I made sure that there was nothing on the ground that she could possibly climb on to get up in that tree. It was a big old tree. And I came back for dinner one evening, and she had somehow arranged, she had pulled her lazy boy chair out through the door. Now these are heavy, right? And she had managed to pull it out through her back door and used the lazy boy to get up into her tree. And I found her so high up, I couldn't get her down, and she refused. So like a 4-year-old, I just said, well, fine, I have fried chicken and mashed potatoes down here for dinner, and I guess I'll eat them all by myself. And she found her way down. And we did have to heat up the chicken again, but she did have dinner with me, and I got her out of that tree.
I'm amazed that you had the fortitude and the composure to think about how to sort of trick her into these things, because to your point, we don't get any training on this. And
Mm-mm.
you can't even imagine some of this stuff playing out, right? I'm sure you can now, but you probably didn't then. And yet you seem to be able to navigate it so well. So, I mean, that kind of blows my mind, I have to say. When she comes out of the tree, when she gets down and she's having dinner, does she remember that she did that to you? Or is it gone? It's just gone.
It's totally gone. And in fact, she would say to me, sometimes I'd be making her a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, and she'd say, "This is so good. What is it?" And I would say, "It's a grilled cheese sandwich, Mom. I have never had one of these before."
Ah,
And, the first time it happened, I would say, "Well, of course you have, Mom. You've made grilled cheese sandwiches for us kids for forever." And then I realized the second time she said it, and the third time she said it, I changed my tack and I said, "Well, would you like me to make you another one?" And she said, "Yes, I would." And then we'd have a nice lunch. And it was just something as simple as
Yeah.
see it through their eyes. Don't argue with them. They obviously don't remember this grilled cheese sandwich, and it doesn't matter. But to us, so many times it does matter. We want to make it right. We want to reason with them, and we want that behavior to go away. And the hardest thing I think to learn is that you have to accept that that behavior is not going away.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. I also was thinking about as you were talking, and I'm kind of comparing the beginning through the progression. I was trying to put my head around which is the worst time. Was the worst at the beginning when you're sort of juggling the half in, half out, the she won't acknowledge it and you're not really quite sure? Or is the worst the end when you lose them altogether? And I don't mean to death. Obviously, when that happens, it's different. But I mean when they're lost to the disease at the end and they don't recognize you anymore and they don't remember anything anymore. Like, is this even a valid question? I feel ashamed to even be asking you this, but is there one? Which one was harder to deal with?
I think it's an excellent question. I wish I could. I wish I could say that it's going to be the same for everyone, because it's not. I've had more people say to me, "Oh, your mother stopped recognizing you." That would crush me. I don't know what I would do if my mother stopped knowing who I was, or my husband didn't know who I was anymore.
Not helpful.
But but in the end, yeah. But in the end, for me, it was the best thing, because I became this nice lady who brought my mother oranges, or who
Mm,
brought my mother a deli cookie, or who sat with my mother and flipped through magazines with her. And she was nice to me. In the early days when she was most confused, most upset, and feeling the most powerless, I was the rotten daughter that had failed her and was tricking her and was being spiteful and controlling. And she truly was angry with me and mean. Oh, so mean to me. I also had people say, I would not go back. How can you go back to that? But again, I think it depends on, it depends on you. So we're different. For me, it was hardest in the beginning.
well, and I think it's worth saying, just again, just to make sure this whole episode is no judgment. Some people will choose not to go back, and some people will choose not to care for their parent, and that's okay. I think everybody has to do what works in their relationship and for their mental health. Like I don't think there's a one size fits all, to your point. It's
Absolutely not. We're
mhm.
all different, aren't we?
Yeah, and we all have different experiences and the whole
Yeah.
gamut of it. So I hadn't even thought about the experience in that full progression. So she doesn't recognize you at all. She appreciates you though as the nice lady, the stranger bringing her treats. Does she remember the strange lady from time to time, from visit to visit, or are you a brand new strange lady that's bringing her treats every time?
I'm a brand new strange lady. every
Every
time,
every day.
every
But
time she
every
would
day
look
is
up and she'd say, "Oh, hello."
I love that though. Every time, every day. It's terrible that I'm saying I love that. But in all that you went through, like every day was a new chance at the end to have sort of that connection in more of a positive way.
That's exactly
Yeah.
right. And that's what I tell people now. Like, it's okay if you messed up today. Show up tomorrow, and it's a whole new day to make a whole new set of mistakes. Just show up. They need you. And it's okay if they were screaming at you when you walked out the door today, because they're not going to remember it tomorrow. I mean, at different stages, they're not going to. It depends again where you are, but there will be a time where they don't remember it. There were times my mother met me at the door and said, "I think I'm mad at you, but I can't remember what for." And I would look at her and I'd say, "Nah, nope, you're not mad at me. Here, have a donut."
I feel really bad laughing, but it's kind of
You
funny.
have to laugh. You do have to
It
laugh, because this is going to be your new thing for a while.
Yeah, you made a good point about get up the next day. If they're mad at you, they're going to forget, but you don't forget. So, how do you come to terms with kind of, I don't know, putting that in a box somewhere, right? I'm not professionally trained here, but somehow you have to manage those emotions and you don't get a restart because you've got the memory.
You hit the nail on the head. And honestly, as I was writing this book and I typed the end, I thought I was writing it to help people feel more normal about their feelings that they developed with their loved one, about their anger issues, their resentment, trying to help them feel like it's a normal thing. It's okay because you're getting fired at. And, anybody who's getting fired at in that succession, is going to have a reaction, and they're going to want to defend themselves, and they're going to have that righteous indignation that how could this person say this about me when I'm only trying to keep them safe? I get that. And that was my original intent. But as time has gone by and I've talked with people now, I've been invited to book talks and had audience participation and questions. And I have seen now more and more that really what I hope people take from this is you get this opportunity to change your stroke, change your opinion about what's going on. And you get this for a very short period of time because it's not that long. It feels like forever as you're caring for somebody, but there is an end to this disease. And that day that it ends, you don't get one more try. You don't get a do-over. And you are left with your memories of how you handled things. Just like you just said, Marianne, it's in your head now. And that guilt can be so overwhelming that's what I would like to help somebody avoid. If they can find a way to find a little joy, a little bit more love, a little more empathy, and understand that their loved one is behaving in this particularly bad way today because they're feeling the most frightened, the most out of control. They're the most confused today when they're behaving this terrible way. And if a person can see that, maybe they can change the way they interact with them that day and put a smile on their face.
You just gave me goosebumps because it really touched me in that I feel like people understanding this and looking at it almost just, I mean, we all have to think about life in general and how short it is. And sometimes we get a smack from reality to be reminded of that. And the truth is we could not wake up tomorrow. But when you're in this cycle, I guess the truth is you cannot wake up tomorrow. And we often forget that, right? The reality is we often forget that. We go through life and we're doing stuff and we get busy and we're not thinking about that all the time. But especially when you're going through something like this, to be able to, make sure you're consciously reminding yourself that this could be the last day, this could be the last interaction. I think that probably puts it in perspective a little bit more.
That's a good life lesson, isn't it? I mean, we see these things like, kiss them like it's your last kiss, and we should probably all try to approach all of our relationships like that.
Right. But it's hard, right? We know even people that are being super mindful, they have to practice that. It's hard. But in this situation, it's sort of like you have a reminder right there in front of you. This is going to end at some point, and you have to think about that.
Yeah. That's when you should educate yourself. I would say anybody who's going through this with a loved one, they need to learn about the disease. And whether it's Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's, frontal temporal lobe, they are all under the umbrella of dementia. So you can call it what you like. They'll have little nuances of differences among them, but they are under this umbrella, and they do have characteristic traits that everyone experiences to some degree. But educating yourself about that is so empowering because you can kind of track them. You can track them through their stages, and you can say, okay, these new behaviors are somewhere around that stage 6 range. And I know that there are only 7. It kind of helps you know where you are in the scheme of things.
I think that's important. And I know I've heard you say before that when you started out on this journey, the internet wasn't what it is and Facebook wasn't what it was and whatever. We didn't have all these social media outlets to get information and all this virtual stuff that you can get information from, podcasts, whatever. It's a different time now. I mean, people really can get educated on anything they want to get educated on in their home very quickly. So I think it's important to note that there's a lot of possibility out there to make sure you get educated.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears. I didn't plan to ask you this question, but it popped into my head while we're talking. And I feel like I'm going to ask you. If it's too personal, you don't have to answer it. Thinking about dementia in the bigger umbrella, I think there's some hereditary possibilities in some of these diseases. Have you thought about that? And is there anything that you are doing differently based on what you saw with your mom?
Well, I have been asked that before. It definitely is hereditary. My mother is one of 7 sisters, and the ones who have lived to an old age all had dementia. So I just can't imagine, that familial trait. I happen to be adopted, so I kind of did dodge a bullet. But if I hadn't been, I would probably be taking great care with things like my diet, my exercise. Those are things, it's exercise your brain. And that's not just crossword puzzles, which, by the way, are good things to do, games that involve your brain. But, the science behind dementia these days, they're finding that the plaques that attack the brain, which cause dementia, they haven't discovered exactly how to avoid that and how to treat that. They're working on it, but they have determined that those plaques are probably developing as early as 20 years before your first symptoms. So that's kind of a frightening thing to realize, but it also kind of backs up, take good care of your brain. And part of that is what you feed yourself with and how you physically stay active. Those are important.
Those are also good life lessons, right? Just in general, but good
Yeah.
messaging. So let me ask you, as we start to kind of wrap up, what are the biggest lessons that you think you got out of this that you would want to make sure, if this was your last talk about this topic for the world to hear, like what's the message you really want to make sure you're conveying to people?
If I only get one,
No, it
I
can
would
be more
say,
than one, but
yeah, I think I do have a couple. Number one, show up, be there. And if you can't be there, gather yourself an army and get some people who can. Saddest days ever we're going to see my mother and seeing the same people out in that common room and nobody there with them, visit after visit. To this day, I go on second and fourth Wednesdays and I play ukulele for them. And I do that because they're so happy when I'm there doing it and I'm playing gospel songs that they can sing along to. And it makes me so sad when I'm doing this and there's no family member in the common room with them. It's just me and, I don't know, 8 of the residents there that come out to listen. I would say show up. And for yourself, for your own mental health and for your own well-being, I would say educate yourself, like I said, so that you can understand better how to interact with your loved one and not react to them, and be easier on yourself if you can. Like I said, too, you're going to screw up. We all are. And tomorrow's a new day. Tomorrow's a new day to try it again. And if you have to apologize to them, apologize to them. What does it matter? Admit that you were a terrible daughter that day. Sometimes that just eased my mother's, sales just by doing that. I'm sorry, Mom, I want to do better. I'm not really sure what I did, but I want to do better.
Humility.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So let me ask you this question. You had retired and you were probably planning to have a nice quiet life after retirement. You're very young, so you were lucky enough to be able to do that. And I'm thinking you probably had some thoughts in mind about enjoying your retirement and living that out. And here you are kind of on the circuit about your book and this story. So what's your life look like after this? Is this something that you now feel like is part of the design of your life and that's going to be like a theme that you're going to carry forward because it's become so important to you? Or is this just a blip and then you're going to move on to something else? How does this play out? Or do you not know yet?
I'm loving this right now. Every day is just some exciting little turn. When I get that email from somebody, Alzheimer's Association contacted me, and I'm going to be their keynote speaker in their March annual Journey meeting in Washington. Yeah, I'm excited about that. Or I'll get a call from somebody saying, "Hey, our book club just read your book. I heard you would do a Zoom for us." And I'm like, "Heck yeah, I'll do a Zoom. Where are you? Phoenix, Arizona? No problem." I love talking about it. I love answering questions from people. And sometimes it's just listening because, they've got such a similar story, and they're wide-eyed like I was. And, they can't believe this is happening to them. And I listen and my heart breaks for them because I know exactly what their road is about to look like.
I love that, all of that, because the whole premise of my show and putting all this together and the things that we talk about is that life is messy. It's unpredictable, it's messy, it's hard, but we can do hard things and there's beauty in those hard things. But I also feel like there's messages in the books and in the stories of other people that can help someone else kind of skip some of the steps, right? Maybe somebody won't have to go through the trying to figure it out of is this normal? Should I feel like this or whatever the scenario, because you've already documented it and they can look at that and they can say, this is normal. She went through this. It looks just like this. And this is the
Yeah.
next stage. And that to me that's the goodness in what we're doing, is really
Right.
trying to help somebody else get there and have sort of a cheat sheet, a cliff notes, right? To what we all have gone through. We've all gone through messes.
Right.
Life is messy. And I often say our mess becomes our message. And I think your mess has now
Mm,
become your message. And I'm thankful for that.
thank you.
You're welcome. On that note, I just want to let everybody know that we will put your links and information about the book and all of that in the show notes. And I just want to say thank you. I appreciate talking to you so much and the work that you're doing. It's really going to make a difference.
I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Message in the Middle with Marianne. If you enjoyed the podcast, please take a minute to share it and write a review, as it helps bring new listeners to our audience. If you'd like to keep the conversation going between episodes, please join us at Facebook group Message in the Middle with Marianne.